In 1942, the Atlantic was no longer an ocean, it was a graveyard governed by death. Under the shroud of midnight, the ocean wind cut like a razor across the decks of the U.S. Navy's escort convoys. Young sailors, their eyes bloodshot and heavy, gripped the icy railings, staring into the churning black abyss. Somewhere in that lightless deep lurked Nazi Germany's most terrifying weapon. Like submerged wraiths, they would glide silently beneath the waves, unleashing a single torpedo that could turn a 10,000-ton steel behemoth into a screaming pillar of fire. The pride of the American Navy had a fatal weakness, a heartbeat that thundered through the water. This wasn't a sound, but a magnetic field. Imagine every warship as a titanic magnet racing across the sea. Due to the Earth's natural geomagnetism, these steel giants constantly radiated a massive electromagnetic signature. In an era before advanced radar, German magnetic mines were a waking nightmare. They didn't need to hit you, they simply sat on the seabed, waiting to sense a ship's magnetic pulse. When they felt that metallic blood in the water, they would detonate like a shark's snap. We aren't sailing. We're running naked through a minefield rigged with explosives, a naval commander wrote in a secret dispatch. This crushing pressure forced the Pentagon to entertain a question that bordered on madness. What if we could make a warship vanish? They weren't talking about smokescreens or camouflage. The Navy's demands were impossibly high. First, they required electromagnetic invisibility to blind the mines and radar. Second, and far more chilling, they wanted physical invisibility. If a destroyer bristling with heavy guns could vanish like a magician's coin and reappear instantly behind enemy lines, the war would be over in a single night. Whoever controlled the right to invisibility controlled the scepter of God, and so in the deepest recesses of the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, behind layers of electrified wire, a top-secret endeavor was born. The name sounded poetic, almost divine, but the scientists involved knew they were playing with fire. They weren't fighting the Axis powers. They were fighting the fundamental laws of the universe. To fuel this absurd ambition, the Navy summoned the greatest intellectual assets in human history. In the sweltering summer of 1943, a black sedan slipped into the base. The man who stepped out was frail and gaunt, yet his eyes held a light that seemed to pierce the veil of the material world. He had long been a recluse, but his name remained a synonym for forbidden scientific power: Nikola Tesla. Tesla was now in his 80s, living in a New York hotel befriending pigeons. But to the Navy, he was the only savior. Einstein's theories suggested that invisibility was theoretically possible, but only Tesla knew how to manipulate reality through electromagnetic force. If you had stood at the Philadelphia docks that day, you would have seen the sacrificial lamb, the USS Eldridge. Her masts were strangled by miles of copper wiring, coils like metallic pythons. Massive capacitors hummed beneath her decks, sounding like a caged beast beginning to wake. The crew was told they were testing a new degaussing technology for defense. None of them knew that when those massive Tesla coils were pushed to full power, they would be leaving more than just the enemy's sight. They would be leaving our three-dimensional reality entirely. The alarms of Project Rainbow pierced the Philadelphia dawn. It was a gamble on the unseen, the first time humanity reached out to touch the forbidden code God had etched into time and space. If Chapter 1 was the smoke and fog of the shipyard, Chapter 2 is the heavy door swinging open to the ultimate secrets of the cosmos. Beneath the cold steel skin of Project Rainbow lay a mathematical soul that would make all of humanity tremble. Its creator was a man who had reconstructed the universe with nothing but a pen and a few scraps of paper: Albert Einstein. In 1925, while the world was still reeling from the shock waves of general relativity, Einstein had already cast his gaze into a deeper void. He proposed a concept so grand it bordered on hubris. In Einstein's eyes, God was not a gambler throwing dice, but a minimalist painter. He believed the chaotic, complex world we see is governed by a singular, elegant logic. He sought to prove that all physical phenomena, from the orbits of stars to the fall of an apple and the strike of lightning, originated from a single, unified force. To explain this to the naval brass, Einstein used a famous analogy. Imagine that all the colors in the world, however brilliant, are merely mixtures of three primary colors: red, green, and blue. If you master the palette, you can create colors the world has never seen. The primary colors of the physical world are gravity, electromagnetism, and space-time. Einstein asserted that gravity and electromagnetism were not separate entities, but two sides of the same coin. Under extreme conditions, through massive electromagnetic interference, one could directly manipulate gravity and even warp the fabric of space-time. To most, this was a scribble on a chalkboard. To the US Navy, it was a ticket to the realm of the gods. "Generals, we cannot eliminate gravity," Einstein reportedly whispered in a closed-door session. "But by controlling electromagnetism, we can create phenomena. We can bend light around an object, achieving total visual erasure." This was the scientific ACE for invisibility: light refraction. If space-time is a flat bedsheet, a warship is a heavy iron ball resting upon it. Normally, light travels in a straight line across that sheet, but if we use a massive electromagnetic field to pinch or fold that sheet, the light will follow the curve, flowing around the ship and meeting on the other side. To an observer on the shore, no light reflects back to their eyes. Their brain tells them there is nothing there. It sounded like the perfect art of war, but it hid a risk Einstein hesitated to name. What if the field was so strong it didn't just bend light but tore the sheet itself? In the laboratories of 1942, this theoretical dread was buried by the hunger for power. The Navy didn't want formulas, they wanted results. They asked Einstein, "Who can turn these ghostly mathematical lines into a field that can swallow a ship?" Einstein fell silent for a moment, then spoke the name that made the very air crackle with electricity. On a night thick with lightning, the two titans met in a secret Philadelphia residence. Einstein, the peak of theoretical physics, and Nikola Tesla, the absolute king of the electromagnetic realm, sat before the same blueprints. Tesla looked at Einstein's complex tensor equations and offered a cold, knowing smile. "Albert, your theory is beautiful, but controlling this force requires more than logic. It requires madness." Tesla knew that to manifest Project Rainbow, the voltage required would be astronomical. He designed a massive Tesla coil array capable of generating a magnetic field tens of thousands of times stronger than the Earth's. In such a field, atoms would vibrate, the air would turn into ionized sludge, and even the human consciousness would be washed by intense electromagnetic waves until it became a blurred mess. It was an unprecedented gamble. The US Navy pushed all its chips to the center of the table. They prepared to build a palette of God on the decks of the USS Eldridge. They were attempting to mix more than just a camouflage color. They were looking for a forbidden light humanity had never touched. Yet, as the experiment neared its climax, Tesla began to see horrifying omens in his lab. The sparks jumping through the intense fields didn't seem random. They looked like whispers from the cracks in space-time, glimmers of a world that did not belong to us. Deep within the labs of Philadelphia, Nikola Tesla was drowning in a sea of isolation and dread. By late 1942, the hum of the massive capacitors custom-built for Project Rainbow no longer sounded like the rhythm of science to Tesla. It sounded like a warning from the abyss. During a private, small-scale simulation, he witnessed a living test animal placed in the center of the field. It didn't just vanish, it underwent a horrific molecular distortion that left it in agony. He realized Einstein's theory was elegant on paper, but brutal in reality. A magnetic field of this magnitude would crush a person's psychic structure like a piece of paper, potentially forcing a terrifying reintegration of flesh and surrounding atoms. This machine isn't building a cloak of invisibility, Tesla warned. It's building a meat grinder. Tesla submitted a scathing report to the Navy. He demanded the project be overhauled, claiming he needed 10 years to study the effects of such fields on the human central nervous system. However, World War II was at its boiling point. The smoke of the Pacific and the shame of Pearl Harbor had drained the military's patience. Mr. Tesla, we want ships that vanish at sea, not a study on the nervous systems of sailors, a naval admiral coldly replied. If you won't do it, we'll find someone who will. Tesla, ever the proud loner, did not blink. In late 1942, he resigned as head of Project Rainbow and retreated to room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel. There, he began writing frantic letters to the White House, trying to stop the impending tragedy. Every single letter vanished into a void of silence. On January 7, 1943, during a howling blizzard, the man who had illuminated the world was found dead in his bed. The cause was listed as heart failure, but disturbingly, within 2 hours of his passing, the FBI had already sealed the room. They hauled away carts of safes filled with Tesla's notes on alternating current, wireless transmission, and, most crucially, his improvements to Project Rainbow. From that moment on, Tesla's death and the Philadelphia experiment were stitched together by an iron curtain of top-secret classification. Tesla had fallen, but the war machine of Project Rainbow could not be stopped. The military needed a replacement. They turned back to Einstein, but after seeing Tesla's equipment, Einstein fell into a long, grim silence. He knew the depth of the canyon between theory and practice. So the Navy brought in the number 3 of the scientific world, John von Neumann. If Tesla was a poetic creator, von Neumann was a cold, heartless logic engine. The father of modern computing and a key figure in the Manhattan Project, von Neumann recalculated the parameters with chilling rationality. He believed Tesla's fears were emotional, and that scientific progress required necessary sacrifice. To assist von Neumann, they brought in electromagnetic prodigy Thomas Townsend Brown. This assembly of the world's highest intellects spent the spring of 1943 turning the USS Eldridge into a steel altar. They mounted 2 multi-ton Tesla coils on either side of the bridge. Miles of superconducting cables were snaked beneath the decks. The crew was replaced with young green sailors, many of whom hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye to their families. They were told they were about to make history. August 12, 1943. Morning. The air in the Philadelphia harbor was so heavy it felt like it was suffocating. 22 officers and men took their stations. The Eldridge's captain felt his palms sweat against the controls. He looked toward the shore, where von Neumann and a phalanx of naval officers stood, their eyes glued to their stopwatches. 9 o'clock sharp. At von Neumann's command, the master switch was thrown. In that instant, the voltage in the entire Philadelphia naval yard seemed to fluctuate violently. The Eldridge didn't hum. It let out a scream, a piercing high-pitched shriek that threatened to tear eardrums. Ghostly blue arcs of electricity began to crawl over the hull like glowing vines. The calm water around the ship began to boil, churned by the sheer intensity of the magnetic storm. "The fog is coming," an observer on the shore cried out. It wasn't a normal sea mist. It was an eerie, fluorescent green fog that expanded rapidly, swallowing the massive ship whole. On the shore, men held their breath, waiting for a miracle. Instead, they witnessed the most terrifying moment in the history of human science. 9:01 a.m. The air at the Philadelphia docks seemed to freeze. As the bizarre green fog pulsed and expanded, the USS Eldridge began to turn transparent, then warped before the eyes of the onlookers until, with a sickening pop, she vanished entirely. This wasn't just visual. In the spot where the ship had been anchored, a massive depression appeared in the water, as if the ship's weight had been deleted from the universe. Seawater rushed into the void, creating waves meters high. On the shore, von Neumann stood up so fast his chair toppled, his hands clutching his clipboard till his knuckles turned white. Seconds ago, a 10,000-ton steel beast was there. Now there was only a terrifying vacuum. However, 200 miles away at the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia, a miracle occurred. According to reports from the crew of the merchant ship SS Andrew Furuseth, a burst of blinding white light suddenly exploded over the calm waters. Through a shock wave strong enough to shatter glass, the massive silhouette of the USS Eldridge suddenly cut into the Norfolk Sea like a ghost. It was the first recorded instance of spatial teleportation in human history. The merchant sailors watched in stunned silence, clearly seeing the hull number, DE 173. But the ship only remained for a few minutes before it vanished again in a violent distortion of air, like ink being wiped from a page. Minutes later, she reappeared in Philadelphia. But when the mist cleared and the shore teams rushed the deck, the cheers of victory turned into screams of pure horror. The experiment was no longer a success. It was a massacre. The deck of the Eldridge was a hellscape of dancing blue sparks. The first things the rescuers saw were the sailors standing near the railings. Their bodies had fused with the steel structure of the ship. One man was buried waist-deep in the steel deck, his upper body thrashing in a desperate plea for help. Another's arm had passed through a bulkhead, flesh and metal interwoven at a molecular level as if they had always been one. Others were convulsing, vomiting uncontrollably. According to survivors, the moment the coils engaged, their senses were ripped away. I couldn't see light, and I couldn't feel gravity, one sailor recalled in a later secret testimony. I felt like I was being shattered into a billion pieces and thrown into a grinder that had no concept of time or space. I heard my comrades screaming, but it sounded like it was coming from 10,000 light years away. This was Tesla's ultimate fear, molecular reintegration failure. The intense field had torn the structure of matter apart to transport it, but upon reassembly the system lost its precision. Human cells and warship steel overlapped in quantum space. Physics calls this material overlap, but in reality, it was a horror beyond any film. Some sailors were physically intact but had lost their souls. They had descended into total schizophrenia, muttering about dimensions that didn't exist. Most disturbingly, in the days following the experiment, some survivors reportedly began to turn transparent while walking in broad daylight, eventually vanishing into thin air like wisps of smoke. Von Neumann stood on the deck, his face ash white. He looked at the bodies embedded in the steel and realized they hadn't opened a door to victory. They had opened the lid to hell. Within an hour of the report, the Navy issued a total blackout order. Erase everything. The men fused to the steel were cut out with acetylene torches, and the contaminated metal was sent to the furnaces. Survivors were committed to psychiatric wards and forced to sign lifelong silence agreements. The Eldridge's logs were scrubbed. The records of that day were incinerated. The official story remained unchanged. On August 12, 1943, no unusual experiments took place at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. But can truth be truly erased? The tremors generated by those Tesla coils left a wound in the ripples of time that would never truly heal. The unhealed wound, the sealed end. By the late autumn of 1943, as the last traces of that green fog dissipated, the U.S. Navy attempted to seal not just the docks, but the very memory of the human race. The USS Eldridge was repainted and dispatched to distant theaters of war, as if moving her across the globe could bury the tragedy of that morning. But the scars left by the laws of physics cannot be covered by a coat of paint. For decades to come, The tremors of that day would haunt everyone who knew the truth. The first man to try and pierce the Iron Curtain was Morris Jessup. A doctor of astronomy and mathematics, Jessup was a man obsessed with the ultimate truth of the cosmos. In 1956, he received a series of cryptic letters from a man named Carlos Allende. Allende described, in bone-chilling detail, the teleportation of the Eldridge, mentioning the sailors fused to the hull. He claimed he was on a nearby merchant ship and saw the whole thing. Jessup was changed by these letters. He began a frantic search for evidence, using his connections to reach deep into naval archives. But on the very day he called a friend, excitedly claiming he had finally found the smoking gun of the Philadelphia experiment, he was found dead in his car. The official ruling was suicide. But strangely, all of Jessup's research notes and the original Allende letters had vanished. His death painted the experiment in an even darker shade of blood. It seemed anyone who got too close to the truth was being erased by an unseen hand. Until 1969, an eccentric old man appeared before the media, claiming to be Allende. He spent the rest of his life flip-flopping, one day claiming he made it all up, the next weeping and saying he had been brainwashed. This erratic behavior successfully turned the Philadelphia experiment into a joke in the eyes of the public. And that was exactly what the intelligence agencies wanted. To disguise the truth as the ramblings of a madman. In 1979, with the publication of the Philadelphia experiment, more buried details surfaced. Researchers found the Eldridge's logs from those specific days were indeed blank. Rumors began to swirl about Project Montauk, a continuation of the Rainbow research. It is said that the project didn't end, it just went deeper underground. The sailors who vanished during the experiment supposedly didn't die. They were lost in the cracks of time. Even today, some residents in Philadelphia claim to see ghosts in 1940s, naval uniforms flickering at street corners, their eyes filled with a hollow, timeless confusion. Whether the Philadelphia experiment is fact or lore almost doesn't matter anymore. It stands as a warning. It tells us that when human ambition outstrips moral boundaries, and when the hunger for power tries to force the hand of nature, we don't find a ladder to heaven. We find a crack into the abyss. Einstein in his later years fell into deep self-reflection. He once lamented, "We have mastered the power to destroy the world, but we have not mastered the wisdom to restrain it." The Philadelphia experiment remains sealed in yellowed files. It is an urban legend, a sci-fi movie, and a permanent scar on the fabric of reality. Whenever a strange fog rolls over the Philadelphia coast, or a nameless shriek of static interrupts a midnight broadcast, people remember that vanished morning. There, humanity tried to become invisible, only to finally see the terrifying nature of its own greed. Welcome to Orphe. Some stories may end, but the truth is only just beginning.